All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating, impartial explainer of a famous historical narrative, pulling directly from our source material. We're unpacking a very specific, incredibly intense moment from the Battle of the Trench. We're going to look at exactly how one single, impossibly stubborn rock became the catalyst for these massive, grand visions of empire. Let's get started. To really feel the weight of the story, we've got to set the scene exactly the way the source does. I mean, imagine the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of this moment. We're at the Battle of the Trench, Jangi Kandak. The companions, the Sahaba, are doing this grueling, back-breaking labor, digging a massive defensive trench into the earth. It is dusty, they are completely wiped out, and time is absolutely critical. And right in the middle of this frantic effort, they hit a wall. Literally. Deep in the dirt, they uncover this massive, immovable rock. And according to the account, despite throwing all their collective strength at it, the thing just won't budge. It brings the entire operation to a total grinding halt. What's really striking about the source material here is just how raw and human it is. When the prophet arrives on the scene, the companions don't try to hide it. They respectfully just admit total defeat. They say, "This rock is very big and hard. It's not breaking with our hands. All our efforts have failed." You can almost hear the frustration, right? These are folks working around the clock under immense pressure, and they're openly admitting they are tapped out. The physical obstacle has just completely beaten them. So into this heavy atmosphere of panic and frustration steps the prophet. The source notes that he walks up to these exhausted companions and asks this remarkably calm, simple question. Why are you troubled? Once they point out the rock, he doesn't just stand back and give an order. No, he physically steps right down into the ditch. He takes the spade, the fada, into his own hands, and declaring Bismillah, meaning in the name of God, he approaches that rock with just absolute focus and vigor. It's a huge turning point in the narrative, shifting instantly from this collective despair to singular, decisive action.
And that brings us to the chronological core of today's analysis. The whole narrative from here hinges on a very specific sequence. 3 deliberate, powerful strikes on this unyielding stone. As we'll see, every single strike is so much more than just a physical blow. It triggers a sudden flash of light and a huge, world-altering prophecy. We're going to break down this sequence blow by blow. Strike 1 pointing to Syria, strike 2 pointing to Persia, and strike 3 aiming down at Yemen. So let's look at how the source describes that very first hit.
The prophet strikes the stone for the first time. Wham! The source vividly describes the physical impact. A large chunk of this supposedly indestructible rock just breaks off and crashes down. But it's what happens at that exact same second that elevates the whole story. Along with the rock breaking, this brilliant, dazzling flash of light suddenly bursts out right there in the dusty trench. It's this wild, dramatic visual disruption right in the middle of all that gloomy, grueling labor. The crucial part, though, is how this sudden light is interpreted. The source tells us the prophet smiles and says, Alhamdulillah, in the first strike, Allah has shown me the forts and settlements of Sham, referring to the region of Syria. He confidently tells his companions that their community, their ummah, is inevitably going to reach those distant lands. And the source makes a point to note that hearing this, a promise of reaching grand, far-off settlements while they're literally stuck digging in a ditch, the companions are just overcome with surprise and incredible joy. The cramped walls of the trench just suddenly expanded to the horizon.
But he doesn't stop there. The rock is only partially broken, right? So he heaves the spade and strikes it a second time. Another huge piece of stone shatters. And exactly like before, this physical breaking is instantly followed by a second brilliant flash of light filling the trench. The pattern is officially set, and you can imagine the anticipation among the companions is just shooting through the roof.
And riding on that second flash comes the second grand prophecy. The source details the prophet saying, Alhamdulillah, now Allah has shown me the palaces of Faras, meaning Persia, and their wealth. He states with absolute certainty that his community will overcome this massive dominant empire. Think about that crazy contrast for a second. You are standing in dirt, bracing for an immediate life-threatening siege, and you are being handed a firm promise that you will inherit the wealth and palaces of an ancient global superpower. It's just a stunning escalation in the story.
Now, before we get to the final strike, I want to pause and point out a really fascinating meta element about the source video itself. The modern creator does something extremely clever here. They deliberately hit the brakes on the narrative to build up suspense. Right before revealing the final prophecy from that third light, the creator actually talks directly to the viewers, asking the fortunate ones watching to jump into the comments and type out the prophet's name. It's a brilliant modern technique, using an ancient historical cliffhanger to drive digital engagement right now today. It just goes to show how these historic narratives are still actively curated to hook an audience.
Okay, so after that little pause for engagement, the narrative hits its absolute physical climax. The prophet strikes the rock for the third and final time. And with this blow, the source tells us the rest of that stubborn rock is completely and utterly pulverized into pieces. The physical roadblock that had literally stopped an army is now just gone. And, right on cue to complete the sequence, a third and final burst of light erupts from the dust.
Which leads straight to the culmination of the prophecy. Following that third light, the prophet announces, Alhamdulillah, now Allah has shown me the treasures of Yemen and their forts. He confirms their reach is going to extend way down into the wealthy southern lands of Yemen. The unbreakable rock is entirely gone, and in its place is this finalized three-part vision of vast geographical and political expansion.
When you lay it all out like this, it brilliantly illustrates the true, massive scope of what the source is presenting. We can essentially trace a rapidly expanding map within these prophecies, first pointing way up north to Syria, then shattering more stone to point east toward the mighty Persian Empire, and finally obliterating the rock completely to point south to the wealth of Yemen. The systematic destruction of this localized, super frustrating physical problem in the dirt is tied, blow for blow, to the promised expansion of a global community. What the source ultimately does here is create a massive, very deliberate contrast. On one hand, you have the immediate physical reality. It's exhausting, it's covered in dirt, it's about heavy spades and physical limits and this dumb, immovable rock in a trench. But on the other side, you have the grand prophesied outcome, brilliant flashes of blinding light, and the ultimate conquest of three distinct, incredibly wealthy global empires. It essentially rockets the audience from the most microscopic, frustrating physical chore you can imagine, straight into a macro vision of unprecedented historical triumph. Which really brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. Regardless of your background, this source material offers a truly profound look at the architecture of historical inspiration. It begs a huge question. How do stories of ultimate triumph function to give people hope when they are staring down seemingly unbreakable everyday obstacles? When all your physical efforts have totally failed, how does a sudden shift in perspective, a vision of a much larger future, give you the energy to just keep striking the rock? It's a deeply fascinating piece of human history and narrative, and it's absolutely worth pondering. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking those big questions.